further ado, without further ado, why don't we go ahead into Donna's presentation? Very much looking forward to that. And so, Donna, please take the lead here.
Take it away. All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Glad you're all here. Hey, Millie. um, so get to talk about this marvelous book some more. I know that Dan had talked about it a while back, but it is just there's been a lot of talk, a lot of buzz, a lot of podcasts, we've talked about it in book club. And to be honest with you, I really only read 2 chapters, but it is the 2 chapters, and those are the ones I'm going to talk about tonight, are just so full. It's just such dense information. And I'm only going to be able to touch on parts of it. And in it, just know ahead of time, she has got so many footnotes and so much documentation. So when I state something and you're going, I wonder if that's true, I'm not going to go back and cite what she did, but it is cited in the book. So she has just got copious notes. And as Dan said, lots of receipts. So wanted to go over, like I said, the first 2 chapters in particular. So in her book, Megan Basham, she reveals in the book that the radical far left secular organizations have targeted and are targeting evangelical congregations, schools, churches, and leaders with the express intent of manipulating the evangelicals, us, to advocate for their political agendas. They are doing it by camouflaging their true motives and goals with Christian-like talk that either truly deceives people into believing their ideals are biblical, or converting these people through to their side with maybe the lure of power, or prestige, or popular acceptance. I don't know, but they have been able to gather some of these big evangelical leaders to put these things in their churches. So this is pertinent because their ultimate goal is to usurp the evangelical voting bloc, which is substantial, to their initiatives, which are anti-Christian, they're anti-human, and anti-US. So that's why they're pertinent, especially now in this so important election. So like I said, I'm going to go through this. These chapters are so full and there's so much information, and I hope I'm not jumping all over the place, but I'm going to do my best to be sequential and logical. Jeffrey had sent out an email because when I was reading, I have to tell you, I had to use this list. There are so many different government and church organizations that are used acronyms. So I gave you guys a list of some of the acronyms that, again, when I was reading these chapters, I had to go back to them because I couldn't remember. So that was why I sent that out to kind of help keep things in line. So the first chapter, I mean, she does an introduction, but the first chapter I wanted to talk about was the chapter on climate change. Now, in this chapter, and as in all of her chapters, she opens with kind of an anecdote. And I like the anecdote that she opened with this chapter with. It was a friend of hers who had called and who was just all up in arms because her church that she had gone to for years had the Advent calendar was all about climate change. She had called Megan and said, listen to this. She goes, on the calendar, on Advent calendar, it's saying we don't have to look far to see injustice, to see creation groaning under the weight of the climate crisis and environmental destruction, to see people turning away from seeing and addressing these realities. Again, on an Advent calendar. And then there was one other thing on the calendar that she brought up. Wait, where was it? That she believes that. Wait, there was one. Oh, wait, all right. So on the calendar it says it can often be hard to find joy today, especially when we allow the reality of the role of our actions play in our changing climate to truly sink in. So her friend says, I don't know. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I thought the Advent calendar should be a little bit more about Jesus. So that was what kind of kicked off the chapter. And when she talked to her pastor, this is how he answered her. He said, if Joseph and Mary were alive today, they would be the ones most impacted by environmental disasters. So it's important we think as world citizens and consider how our choices affect the poor and other parts of the world. So that's the kind of thing that has infiltrated evangelical churches, again, by intent, by design. So we go on after she talks about that. So we're going to cite some statistics here. So in 2022, the National Association of Evangelicals released a statement that supporting policies to reduce carbon emissions is what it means to love the least of these. So we go on to kind of why are these left-wing entities reaching out to the evangelicals? And it says in Pew Research, it says religious Americans are so religious, not necessarily even evangelical, but religious Americans are the least likely to be climate alarmist, and evangelicals are least likely subgroup to be even concerned about climate change. However, the evangelicals present a large voting bloc. According to her, 45% of voters are identified as evangelical, and the evangelicals are the largest bloc preventing the climate agenda. So that is why the evangelicals are being targeted, because right now we are what stands between their evil agenda moving forward and not. So there are a number of entities that had gotten together to kind of start pushing this agenda. So we have the National Religious Partnership for Evangelicals that in an effort to increase their funding and awareness from liberal mainline Catholic and Jewish coalition, because they're pretty liberal and they were donating anyway, but they wanted to broaden that base and get more money. They looked to the roughly 45% of voters who identify as evangelicals. And in that effort, the Evangelical Environmental Network, EEN, was created. They targeted National Evangelical Network, NEN, and the Southern Baptist Convention Ethics and Religious Liberty Convention. So these people are targeted to try and get them on the side of this left-wing climate change. They have a stated mission. So their stated mission is, so in 1993, the Evangelical Environmental Network was born. Its mission to win average churchgoers to the green cause by leveraging the influence of trusted institutions like Christianity Today and the National Association of Evangelicals. They have a stated goal. Their stated goal that said from 2000 to 2004, the EEN, Evangelical whatever network, environmental network, slowly laid the groundwork for national evangelical institutions to grasp climate change as a moral issue. EEN's strategy was to integrate climate care into the core of the evangelical subculture by building a bench of national evangelical elites who framed climate change as a moral issue and called for decisive policy action. The expectation was that these ideas would then trickle down to the rank and file evangelicals. And then their method to do this, again, which is stated, they kind of called it, in a tacky way, rent an evangelical model. And it was that they use a leader in a trusted organization who knows the lingo to persuasively sell a message to what would otherwise have been to an unreceptive audience. They explained that the object was to collect strange bedfellows and sort of sneakily break down the faith coalition from the inside. And then the evangelical voice would then give cover to Republican members of Congress to support climate action. So it's just so intentional and it's just so covert how they're doing this. So the EEN and the EIT and these other NAE, they were all working on this, and they were targeting the ERLC, which is the Evangelical, where was that one? Hold on. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the SBC. Because they thought if they could at least get them neutralized, it would help their cause, even if they didn't convert them all over. So we have, and so as they're working together, the EEN, They had backers they started in 1993. By 2006, they had the Clinton Global Initiative was one of their backers. Yeah, the Clintons. The Hewlett Foundation, which I didn't know what that was, but Megan says the Hewlett Foundation is one of the world's largest grant makers, which has long invested vast sums in abortion and family planning programs as part of its interest in controlling population, provided money to the EEN. They also started another coalition called the Evangelical Climate Initiative. So all of these left-wing entities are coming together to fund converting evangelicals to their cause. So they're backed by the left-wing secular money, specifically intentionally target evangelicals to deceive them into believing that embracing climate change agenda was part of being a good Christian. And this first push that was in the from 1993 to about 2006 or so didn't really work. They were pushing certain agendas, and again, it goes into detail in the book, but they were pushing certain agendas, and it didn't go through. But what it did do is that it created a pathway. So the first, even though it failed from 93 to 2008, from 2008 to 2015, they kept pushing with backers like, again, the Environment Defense Fund, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, that same Hewlett Foundation. But then in 2015, this is when our friend George Soros gets involved. And he has funded what's called New America. And what they did, they studied the EEN and what they did and why they didn't make it. And they learned from their mistakes. And they created a different model. The model they created, they proposed to infiltrate the evangelical ranks from within, like the Marxists did, and they want to get it from the within evangelical universities and individual congregations to this end, a bottom up instead of a top down, to get the students to believe and spread that word. And to this end, in 2021, there was a conference dedicated to climate in the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, where, among other things, they preached in this seminar, believers who do not view climate change as an environmental crisis possess less love for God's creation. They said that compared Christians who are skeptical of man-made climate change are like Pharisees and antebellum slavery defenders, how that fits in, but they're going to use the worst language they can. And again, it's the man-made climate change. They're not giving any room to say, yeah, climate's changing, but they are specifically blaming mankind. The SEBTS conference centered on convincing theology and ministry students that global warming is a cataclysmic man-made problem that faithful Christians must mobilize to solve. So again, in the same institution in 2022, there was a man named Jonathan Moo, who they had invited to the seminary. He's a professor. And he had quoted at this seminary that we're teaching as part of the SBC. He had said he was creating a new class of extra biblical commands. Creation care, he said, is necessary in order to be faithful to the gospel. It's not an option. It's not just something we might add on to lots of other programs we might do. And the reason why is this is absolutely vital and should be woven into all we do and proclaim is first and foremost because it's part of the gospel. So he's adding to the gospel that creation care and man-made climate change is part of the gospel. So there was a lot more. Like I said, I'm having to really abbreviate this chapter. It has just got so much information. But all of this to say that we, evangelicals and Christians, are being targeted with malice aforethought by the far left secular organizations to change our beliefs so they can achieve their nefarious political goals. So people might say, well, why do we care? This is why we care, because one, they're doing it clandestinely. They're not being above board about it. They're not going into churches and being open about it. They're they have 2 or 3 organizations back, and they don't confess that Soros is one of the main funders, or these other entities that support abortion and such. So they are doing this in the name of love your neighbor and love and steward God's creation. So we want to be aware of their agenda going in. And I think that there are 2 ways that we can kind of set up our defenses and educate other people, kind of like an apologetics. But one, at these conferences and any of the things that they do not ever present another side. It's always just one-sided. And usually it's just one scientist that is claiming that the climate cataclysmic demise of the planet. Whereas there are copious amounts of scientists who do not buy into that and are the opposite. And that there were Christian scientists who had written letters on the other side that they pointedly ignored. So that is one thing to bring up. If someone's going to say to you, yeah, but all the scientists agree, or this scientist that wrote something, even maybe in a church writing, you can point out that really that was just one person, and that there are 2 sides to this story. But to me, one of the most powerful way to kind of push back on this, we're doing it for love of neighbor and love of planet, and because we want to help those that can't help themselves, the least of these. She gives 3 powerful examples of how climate change initiatives did the exact opposite of helping. And I'm not going to read them in full, but I want to give these examples. So in the first one that she cited, it was in Sri Lanka. So she says, in 2019, formerly impoverished Sri Lanka was a nation on the upswing. After successive years of impressive economic growth and an increasing gross national income, the World Bank upgraded it from a lower middle income rating to an upper middle, bringing it on par with Argentina, China, and Russia. 3 years later, the economy collapsed. By June 2022, fuel supplies were so short that buses, medical vehicles, and other basic services had stopped running. A foreign exchange crisis meant imported necessities like antibiotics, canned milk, and even toilet paper were suddenly unavailable. Babies were born underweight, and malnourished children started fainting in school as food shortages left around 30% of the population hungry. Eventually, protesters stormed government buildings, and the president fled the country. A range of culprits contributed to the crisis, but the most significant was a 2021 green policy banning imports of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And as a result, rice yields dropped 30%, and exports of tea, which had been Sri Lanka's major cash crop, fell to their lowest point in 23 years. That was the first example. Second is in Ghana. So she said the West African nation of Ghana in 2018, the formerly impoverished country, boasted one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with the biggest gains coming from a thriving cocoa bean trade and recently discovered offshore oil deposits. As the New York Times put it that year, cocoa is Ghana's other natural bounty, and producers are piggybacking on the oil boom. Unfortunately, all that bounty drew the attention of the World Bank, which struck a deal with the Ghanaian government to transition away from polluting and expensive oil-burning electricity towards solar and hydropower. In essence, the World Bank was telling a developing African country to give up a huge source of wealth that would transform the lives of future generations to go back to the fields and grow chocolate. By 2021, Ghana went from a net exporter of electricity to experiencing the prolonged frequent blackouts of its developing world past. No electricity meant farmers could no longer access water they needed to irrigate crops that were already dwindling under less effective organic fertilizers mandated by the Paris Accord. When the war in Ukraine compounded Ghana's fertilizer troubles, the European Union refused to help because supporting fertilizer production in developing nations would be inconsistent with the EU energy and environment policies. So, meanwhile, in the US, the National Association of Evangelicals released a report telling American Christians that supporting the very policies responsible for all this is what it means to love the least of these. So I think that, and there's one more example, but by citing these examples, when people say that, oh no, we're doing it to help people. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It does the exact opposite. She's talking the electric car thing, which drives me nuts, I have to tell you. But she brings up the example of take the lithium ion batteries needed to power electric cars and store solar energy. Producing such batteries requires cobalt that right now is being dug out of the ground by slaves in the Congo, including many children, some as young as 4. They toil in tunnels and pits in the heat for 16 hours at a stretch, breathing in toxic fumes. There's no other option for work as their villages were bulldozed to make way for the cobalt mines. Walls and tunnels frequently collapse, amputating the lucky, burying the rest alive. The mines are destroying the local ecosystem and poisoning the waters, requiring the clear cutting of trees. So to just blanket say that to do these climate initiatives and to buy into these things, it's just not true. It's just false on its face. So I thought that those were good examples of how to push back on the climate initiatives. So for that chapter, I was going to go on to immigration, unless did we want to pause or any comments or any questions before I move on to chapter 2?
Why don't we pause just very, very briefly here? Let's see, how are we doing for time?
I know,
Oh,
I don't know how much, and
7:30. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And I
yes.
don't have to do the immigration, Jeffrey. It's okay. Yeah.
Well, any comments or questions? One thing about this issue of Americans wasting environmental resources at the expense of the rest of the world, especially poor countries. Now, we know that the greatest environmental polluters by far are China and India. And yet, the United States is always out front when it comes to who's to blame on these matters. Yeah.
Well, it's also been noted in more than one report and more than one book that, of course, doesn't get touted by the media. The fastest way, all right, so the highest income countries like America and Europe and such produce the least amount of pollution. The poorer countries produce the most. So the best way to reduce their carbon output is to allow them to become successful and become richer so that they can then focus on the initiative to reduce their carbon output, if that's really the goal. But that also isn't talked about.
Mm-hmm. These evangelical leaders, sometimes very influential pastors or media people, it's just astonishing how undiscriminating they are when it comes to um, absorbing and accepting a lot of this mainstream propaganda.
Yes.
Um,
I didn't point out that two of the ones that Megan mentions for the EIT and the EEN, it was Richard Land from the SBC president from 2013 to 2021, who was a big part of it, and then Russell Moore, who was the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission from 2013 to 2021. So those were two of the biggest names in the EIT. So.
Donna,
I
that
don't
link,
really believe it, or they like the notoriety. I don't know.
mm.
I was Donna, I was going to ask you that link between George Soros and the NAE. That's a good solid link. Like there's definitely a connection there that she says in the book.
Yes, she had it. It was on. She had said it's from the Open Society, which was founder was George Soros, and there's a direct link that they are the largest backer of the NIF, which is the National Immigration Foundation, which is also the supporter of the EEN. And at one point, and I've got to find it, I didn't note it here, she was saying that those two entities, the NIF and the EEN, there really was no difference it was just the names were different, but on paper they're the same entity, and that there's a direct link from the Open Society, which was founded by George Soros, to being one of their biggest backers. I'll
Mhm.
find the page number and put it in the comments because I didn't.
Yeah, I was just,
which
yeah, I was
page.
just interested in the National Association of Evangelicals. I can't, it's amazing to me that they wouldn't flag Soros, you know? That's
Right,
just stunning to me.
right. It's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Well, and
But
personally,
he
I can,
notoriously hides it. I mean, he's notoriously, and of course he has enough money and enough minions to hide where this money comes from, which is what makes it, I think, one of the worst parts of it is that the
Mhm.
whole thing is being hidden. They're intentionally targeting us, and they're not being honest about it, and neither are the people that are talking about it in the big EVA, a lot of them. So.
yes. Yeah, there's major institutional failures with evangelicalism in general, but I think I understand the psychology uh, of a lot of these people. I was involved in the Christian left for quite a few years in the late 70s, early 80s, and so on. In fact, I was one of the founders of the Atlanta chapter of Evangelicals for Social Action. I noticed that she mentions ESA
Mhm.
in that chapter and was actually offered a position in the home office up in Philadelphia. By God's grace and God's intervention, I decided to pass on that offer. But um, it would be wonderful to take, a regular session sometime in future and talk about what is it that draws well-meaning Christians to some of these left-wing, at least quasi-socialist, organizations and so on, like ESA. Chuck has a comment, I know.
You're muted, Chuck.
Oh, Chuck, you're muted right now.
Still muted. Hold your space bar down.
Oh, yes, you could just hold the space bar on your.
That makes
There
sense.
you,
I
there
wish I
you
had
go.
done that. One of the things about this situation is there's a certain sense of naivete in the churches, that there are people who control these countries, the World Bank and the IMF are controlled by the US, to basically keep them debtor nations so that the Western G7 countries can continue to extract natural resources from them. They're not really interested in these countries, third world countries, becoming second or first world countries, because that would increase the cost of many of the things that our country runs on. And so it's just interesting to see how they, meaning church leaderships who buy into this, think that there's some social good that they're actually going to try to accomplish. And as always, follow the money. That's really all I have to say. So
I think you're right. I think it is a bit of naivete because they intentionally couch their words in Christianese, so to speak. You're helping the planet, you're being a good steward, you're being a good neighbor, you're loving your neighbor. If the whole world is going to collapse, then of course you have to do whatever you can to save the whole world. But it's just a false premise. But people don't look beyond that to try and see that that's not true and it doesn't really help. But I think that is it.
a classic example of this is something called the National Endowment for Democracy.
Mm.
The National Endowment for Democracy is funded by the U.S. and other U.S. corporations. They go into countries to promote democracy, but the countries they go into are places where the U.S. has identified somebody as a pro-Chinese or pro-Russian president. And then we decide it's time for a regime change. And then we orchestrate that regime change and promise the incoming incumbent that if he actually gets in, we'll promise him all sorts of funding from the IMF and from the World Bank that makes them a debtor nation, and they get their 10%. So, I mean, it's a nasty world out there.
Right.
So,
Indeed. And they really exploit, for instance, God's command to Adam and Eve, to have dominion over the earth, be caretakers and stewards of the environment, which we all should be. We should be very environmentally conscious, but they really extend that into, frankly, a very secular socialist, agenda. Donna, we probably need to move on.
No worries,
I
that's
know you
fine.
had
Yes.
another chapter you would have liked to have covered, and that book is should be required reading for all serious Christians. In
It's
fact, we
excellent.
shouldn't allow anybody to join our local church who hasn't read that book.
I agree. I agree.
It's so informative. But we thank you. It really brings up some very disturbing trends,
Yes. Yes.
and there's so much more in that book as well. If you're in a book club, I would highly recommend that you propose that your group read that book, the Megan Basham book.
Well worth it.
Discuss it. Yeah. Well, let's move on here then. Thank you, Donna.
You're
And
welcome.
so Scott has I asked him to comment on some aspects of our course or some of the topics we address. So Scott, very much looking forward to your input.
Amen.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Very faintly on my.
How would I raise that up, Lori? Is that any better?
If it could be louder.
Okay. How do we do this? All right, I'm just going to talk louder. How about that?
That's good.
All right. All right. Well, so Jeffrey asked me to give a mini sermon tonight. And of course, I'm an Areopagus rookie. I feel like I'm a rookie. So, but it's on faith, culture, and politics and our responsibility as followers of Jesus. So I'll do my best here and we'll see how this goes. I came up with 4 tips. And, when you do a sermon, you're supposed to have a title. So I called this Wiser Than the Serpent. Some tips on how Christians can push back against the devil. So I got 4 tips and I'm going to number these for you and then we'll talk about them. Okay. So the first one is to know the nature of the battle, that it's a supernatural battle that we're in. The second one is to understand the ideology that Satan is aligned with. The third one is to know the tactics of the enemy. And the fourth one is to know the comprehensive nature of the gospel. So we'll go back over these here in a bit. But I wanted to say to start out with, I'm an optimist in the long run. So I believe Jesus is going to win the war, but I'm a pessimist in the short run. So I believe the church is going to be late to the battle. And I've seen this quite a bit, it seems to me, in my life. The church is always coming in behind and not, and Bonhoeffer's a good example of this in the Metaxas book. He was on target, but so many other of the pastors weren't. So I don't know if y'all are, I'm going to talk about a few movies here. Maybe you're familiar with the movie The Matrix, but you don't have to be. There's a scene in that movie where there's a choice between a red pill and a blue pill. It's a pretty famous scene. And I won't elaborate on that except to say that Lori and I have decided to take the black pill. And what I mean by that is she's adopted my pessimism, basically. I learned this principle in the Navy. Expect the worst and you'll never be disappointed. So it's a really pessimistic approach to life, but it seems to work out a lot of times for me. So we're planning for a Harris victory and the end of America in a couple weeks. And if it doesn't happen, we'll be pleasantly surprised. But then I thought of a quote from Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, there's always hope. So therefore we continue on, hopefully, as the Areopagus and keep fighting this battle. So there's 4 principles here. The first one is the nature of the battle, that it's a supernatural one. And I think we all realize this. I mean, just Donna's presentation alone, I think would demonstrate that to us. But Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. And there's a book Lori's reading right now called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. It's by Andy Bannister.
Mm.
And he lists the kind, because this is done, this Ephesians 6 is in the context of the armor of God. All right, that statement. And so Andy Bannister, he lists some garments that we usually go out into battle with. And he says we put on the flip-flops of fear, the socks of silence, and the underpants of uncertainty. And I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, I think a lot of Christians just don't, or they're not equipped, to handle some of these things. So we need to be more equipped. That's the point. We need to realize that there's a battle going on. I've heard some Christians say things like, I don't like to characterize all this as a battle, all these cultural wars, and use that terminology. The gospel is really about loving people and so on. But it's simply to deny reality, that there is a battle going on. And I'll quote Aragorn one more time. I apologize for all these Lord of the Rings references, but open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not,
That's my favorite quote.
Is it really?
One of my favorite. I love it. I love it.
So
Yeah.
it's so applicable, I think, to Christians today.
Yes.
We don't wish for an ideological war, but it's upon us nonetheless. So we need to be prepared and equipped. There's those people that might say that the battle is the Lord's and our role is just to stand by and watch him win it for us. Maybe you've heard that approach. I just would point out that the pronoun here in Ephesians 6 is plural. Paul calls this our struggle. I think that's a pretty good indication that we're supposed to be in the battle. And so, the struggle is a supernatural one. It's not liberals we're fighting against. It's ultimately Satan and his minions. So there's a battle going on. It's our battle. It's supernatural in nature. If we don't have that nailed down, we're going to lose the battle. Second one, we need to understand the ideology that Satan has aligned himself with. And again, I think we all know this. When we look at the politics of what's going on today, it's the left. And of course, to really demonstrate this point would take a while, perhaps, to some people. I think for us, it wouldn't take long at all. I think we talk about this all the time in the Areopagus. It's a Marxist, socialist, trending communist agenda. We see it all the time. It's an American form of Marxism, to be sure, but it's repackaging the same principles of Marx and Lenin and so many of the others. And you've got new leaders, and they would tell you that we should try this again because they're in charge now and they're going to finally do it the right way, So, but we've got common sense and history and our reasoning powers in the Word of God and so many other things to come to our aid and help us to answer this with a resounding no. And it's the ideology, as you know, is just fundamentally godless. We see this in a myriad of ways, and it's an essential point. It's that in the unguarded moments of the left, when they talk about this, they'll even tell us this if we're listening close enough, I think. And it ought to be taught in churches. But I think, as Donna was demonstrating, it takes the courage of a Bonhoeffer, and this kind of courage seems to be in short supply. So a lot of books to read about this. I don't think there's quite a few I could probably mention. I did want to focus on one here and read a quote. And I know this is an old one. It's called The Naked Communist. I don't know how to say this, Jeffrey. It's Skousen, I believe, is the author. I may be saying that wrong. And I looked this up. He's actually a Mormon. Is it Skousen?
I believe it's Skousen, isn't it? Z-O-N, isn't it?
S-O-N.
Oh, is it? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think, yeah. But I realized he was a Mormon. That really doesn't have much relevance to the points he makes in the book. But I did want to read this quote. This is actually by his son, Paul, who wrote some more after the final 8th edition of this thing. It's a famous book. I mean, a lot of people have referred to it, Ronald Reagan and Ben Carson and so on. But he says the 45 Goals of Communism were first published in the 8th edition of the Naked Communist in March of '61. They were gleaned from testimony given to Congress by various scholars and from the writings of current or former communists. In 1963, these 45 goals were read into the Congressional Record by Albert Herlong, was a Democrat from Florida, and since that time they've been shared worldwide. The general thrust of the 45 goals was to attack the Judeo-Christian underpinnings that had long prospered and protected freedom, and to replace them with the bricks and mortar and top-down force of a purely socialist society. And he goes on to list all these 45 goals, and it's just fascinating to look at those goals, and then you'll look at our culture today and see how many of those just resonate with what's happened. So it's just a fascinating read. It's something you might check out at some point. How all these things have really, it's almost prophetic, how these things have come to pass. So, we're dealing with an ideology here that Satan has aligned himself with. I think that's pretty clear, at least to us. We might need a little more ammo and ways to talk about it for people that don't understand that, but that's part of the training, right? So now, if we know the supernatural nature of the battle, we know the ideology the enemy's using, then it would follow that we need to know the tactics that the promoters of this ideology are using. There's many writers we could refer to here. I think of Solzhenitsyn primarily, probably the most important of all. But there are many others, and I wanted to go with Saul Alinsky in his book, Rules for Radicals. This was released in 1971, and Alinsky, Obama and Hillary Clinton especially have been enamored with Alinsky, the way I understand it, written about him. And it's interesting, in his book, he kind of starts it off with a nod to Lucifer. And he says he was the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom. So that kind of gives away the approach of Alinsky here at the beginning. And he lists a lot of different tactics of the radicals, but I'm just going to focus on three tonight. The first one is creating confusion. I'm calling these are kind of my paraphrases, but creating confusion and disorganization, highlighting the hypocrisy of your enemy, and picking the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. So how are these played out today? Well, tactic number one, confusion, disorganization, irrationality, lack of order. You could call it all these different kinds of things. For example, we never get to the substance of Kamala Harris, do we? If you're just watching and listening for substance, it's amazing that we don't ever get anything. She won't answer questions. She ducks and dodges anything that might touch on the substance of what she believes. I think she can't. The idea that I think behind that is, if you don't commit to anything, you can't be accused of believing in anything, so you can't be attacked. Of course, once you believe in something, you can be attacked then at that point. So the use of confusion, disorder, in order to get power, the blurring of truth and lies, the suggestion that truth is no longer really true, that it's okay for one's position to be constantly changing, and that there's no solid foundation anywhere, anymore. It's just all up in the air, no truth. These are obviously, to me, tactics of our supernatural enemy. I mean, just to create confusion and disorder and make people question everything, to me, is a real sign that we're in the realm of our enemy. The second tactic is to highlighting hypocrisy in your enemy. So make the enemy live up to his own principles, right? Well, one of the principles of Christians that the left highlights is to not say anything to anyone that's offensive, right? And obviously we don't want to be offensive to people. We don't want to be. And so a lot of times when they say, hey, you're being offensive, you're offending me, our first thought is, oh my gosh, we don't want to offend anybody, or maybe something's wrong with our approach here. So we back off in many cases, and we're put on the defensive. And I would just like to suggest that maybe we need to reconsider how we think about that. I certainly don't have all this figured out, but maybe a better response or something to think about here to this tactic is to say something like, look, let me explain to you why we think as Christians that it's important to not relinquish truth for the sake of being harmless. Harmlessness is not goodness. It's potentially akin to cowardice, or also perhaps akin to the inability to articulate what you believe. And then goodness has a boldness component to it as well. And we certainly see these things in Jesus over and over. We see boldness in the New Testament. And so then you could go on to cite some examples and kind of go on from there. But you're turning the discussion a bit from being defensive to maybe going on the offense by citing Jesus and some boldness that he, you know, exercised in the New Testament. So what if you get this question? How could you possibly vote for evil orange man and call yourself a Christian after all he's done, right? He's just so awful. How could you possibly do this? If you do that, I'll probably don't ever want to be a Christian, right? So we're on the defensive immediately with something like that. But maybe we could say something like this. Let's make sure we draw a distinction here between all he's done and all he's been accused of doing. And you could parse some of that out, because there's a whole lot he's been accused of doing that I think is what people think he really did. And that makes a lot of difference, I think, in this discussion. But yeah, Christians have principles. We have the highest principles, I think. And so, you know, how can we possibly live up to our principles? They're too lofty and too high. But you could say, look, you know, our principles are really high. We struggle to live up to them. What are the principles of the left? I would argue that the main principle of the left is power at all costs, which, you know, it's fairly easy to live up to if that's your only goal. And seems to me the inability to live up to high principles is much better than the ability to live up to an evil principle. So you could twist it around like that maybe and say some things that would get them to think and make it more offensive and less defensive for you. You know, we might be called hypocrites, but to opt out of doing politics because Trump is flawed is like, it's if you're going to be consistent, it's to opt out of everything. I mean, everything's flawed. And Jeffrey's made this point, you know, everything in life is flawed. I think you have. Everything in life is flawed to some degree, and we can't opt out of life. So the logic really doesn't hold there. Yeah, and we just have to try to express these things in a way that maybe puts the other side on defense, certainly not in a mean way, but in just a discussion context. And it's tough, you know, to articulate all this on the spot and come up with the right things to say. I think it just requires a pretty substantial level of familiarity with how you defend all this, which requires training, which is what we ought to be doing in the church, but we don't for whatever reason. So the third tactic there, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. And man, we see this all day long with Donald Trump. He's obviously the target. And without Trump hate, I think Kamala has no prayer of winning. And her campaign's fueled by hate for Trump. Anytime she's concerned with, or she's cornered with a serious question, she diverts to Trump and how awful he is. And she's picked the target. This is just a tactic of the left. I don't know if she absorbed this from Obama or where she got it, but it's straight out of Alinsky's book. So just some tactics, you know, just some tactics and we can spot them, you know, if you're familiar with the tactics, you can spot them every time you listen to these people talk. So it's important to know what they are, and so we can be ready and maybe in our discussions with our never Trumper friends, you know, maybe bring some of these to light. So the last one that the last principle I've got, I think this is critical for us to be aware of is to know the comprehensive nature of the gospel. You know, a lot of people say, well, the only thing that matters really here is the gospel. So we'll sacrifice everything else and we'll just present the gospel? Well, I think if you sacrifice everything else, by the end of it there, you've got a different gospel potentially that you're presenting. So I've got a couple quotes here I'd like for you to just think about. This is there was a book written called Tactics by Greg Kukul. Perhaps most of you are familiar with that. He wrote another book called The Story of Reality, and this quote is from The Story of Reality. It says this: "The next time you see something, a moment in a film, or embrace a vista that transfixes you, or hear something, a poem or a melody or a bit of a story, or you detect a faint fragrance that sends you in the same moment back to a forgotten time and forward to a new, unknown one, and you find that deep down inside of you something moves and you're transported and you want to weep, though you're not sure why, I want you to think in that moment that God is giving you a foretaste of his glory. And one day we will lay hold of it in its fullness." And I just really love that quote. It has a comprehensive ring to the gospel is a worldview. It's a worldview, what we believe, and it encompasses everything, all of reality. And that's the book's title, The Story of Reality. It's everything. You know, it's how we approach everything. It's not just this isolated Romans road. Here's how you get to heaven. It's so much bigger and larger than that. It encompasses all of life. And the Metaxas quote that kind of, I think, goes along with this is on page 126. He says, what Bonhoeffer was saying, I think this is when he was writing his prison letters. He's saying we need a true and deep Christianity, one that is not merely religious, but one that understands that we are to live out our faith with every atom of our being and every second we have here on this earth, and with every breath God gives us to breathe. So it's just the comprehensive nature of the gospel, and it touches every aspect of reality. And that's the gospel I want to try to share. And obviously I fall way short. Our principles and what we believe is so much higher than what we can live up to. But I think that's the gospel we want to try to share, not a watered down version of it that doesn't communicate to people that it's a lot bigger than they think. So I just got a few other statements here. The gospel I would like to share as opposed to another gospel. What sort of gospel is it that we share with others if we're indifferent to the collapse of nations who are brutally attacked by terrorists and communist regimes? What kind of gospel is that we just ignore that? What sort of gospel is it that we will not stand against those who have no regard for the most helpless children, the millions of unborn who will be sacrificed so others can have control of their own bodies? End quote. Quote. What kind of gospel do we preach that will not stand against vast levels of corruption in our own government, funding and supporting foreign enemies and undermining allies with no accountability ever to these people? What kind of gospel do we have that will not stand against people who want to continue to degrade the freedom of those in a Christian influenced nation such as our own and replace it with the tyranny of an atheistic ideology? And we could go on and on and on with these. But I just think that if we choose to just reduce this election down to as important as these things are, just economy and the price of gas and some of these basic things you hear on the news, it's so much bigger than that. Our enemy is behind all this, and the things that are at stake are so much larger than what we hear, I think, on the news. And to reward these people with even 4 more years would just be so disastrous, I think, for the world, not just the US, but for the world. So hopefully these tips can be helpful. Just praying that God will set things right, and we can have opportunities to help in that as we're able. I think if all the Christians would vote correctly, I don't think this election would be close. And I think the left would be out, and there'd be a whole lot of good that could be done in the world. But that'd be a good thing, I think. So.
Amen. Yeah, thank you, Scott. Excellent. And, I'm really glad that you mentioned Greg Kokel's book, Tactics. We use that in a course called Frontline Apologetics, where we take on not only classical apologetical issues, the reliability of the Bible, the historicity of Jesus Christ, a lot of those foundational Christian values, beliefs, but we also address a lot of cultural issues in that course as well, and use those excellent guidelines that Greg Kokel, explains so well in his book Tactics.
Yeah.
That's probably something that we need to go back and revisit, on a regular basis. As you were talking, and I looked here at Margaret, I just thought, oh, how I would love to hear from Stuart and Stuart's comments on all of this, because I know he had a wonderful grasp of reality in every aspect of reality. And I know he was just so highly admired and respected. I see here under chat, just real quickly here, Chuck wrote, okay, I guess this is where we can find on Amazon.com the book by Leon Skousen that you mentioned, The Naked Communist.
Yes,
And
Jeffrey, I actually tried to put every link to a book as Scott was mentioning it, so that people could just literally save the chat and have all the links to the books that Scott was mentioning, because they were all very good.
oh, okay.
All right.
Okay.
The one that I don't think he mentioned should have been Screw Tape Letters.
Well,
Because-
yeah.
Hey, C.S. Lewis is so widely quoted. I try to get away from C.S. We quote him so much, There are other people out there, but yeah, definitely. He definitely should have been there.
He pretty much ranks right behind Jesus, doesn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
By the way, Chuck, how do you save these messages?
There are at the bottom, there's 3 buttons at the bottom of the chat. And when you hit that, it says Save Chat. Do you see that at the bottom of the chat window? If you've opened your chat window, there's 3 buttons at the bottom that are sort of like an extended, to click on for an extended menu. And it says Save Chat.
Oh, okay.
All
okay.
right.
Yeah.
So.
Oh,
Yeah.
the top.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions related to Scott's comments? Anything?
I think both Scott and Donna did an excellent job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Millie. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
And it was interesting today. We were on the road catching up with all of our podcasts. And of course, Moeller and World and everything in it, and lots of the things that you all addressed or alluded to, for sure. I'm still fascinated that Kamalek is welcome to speak in these Black churches, and these Blacks are then they're registering to vote after she speaks, and she's speaking about faith and bumbling around, and they're just falling for it.
Well, and then someone in the crowd yells out, "Jesus is Lord, Christ is King."
But that was at an event. I'm talking about the churches she spoke in Atlanta over the weekend.
Okay, that was not in a church.
I think that was at a Planned Parenthood or something. I think that was in
a rally or something.
A rally. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, and Victor Davis Hanson, if you're not listening to him, I see Margarita's on. She turned me on to him, and he just has great insight. If Americans were as thinking and is, and listening to people like him, it would be a different world out there.
Amen. Absolutely.
I could add one other thing, Jeffrey. Lori and I are doing a thing from Hillsdale, which is where Victor Davis Hanson teaches. And it's about communism, socialism. It's a 5-part DVD kind of series. We've done 2 of them. It's just a whole history of communism. And it's really good so far. So it's something to think about. Hillsdale has a lot of good sources for this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And they're all
Yeah.
free,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Mhm.
they ask for
Yes.
donations. They're free. Yeah.
Yeah, Victor Davis Hanson is a regular guest on the Eric Metaxas radio program too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen him on Fox News a good many times too.
Right.
Boy, if we could go back 75 years and set out a priority scale for Christians in America, I think supporting Hillsdale College and founding Hillsdale type colleges in every state in America would have to be a top priority. It is just absolutely excellent. Well, we better move on here. And I had asked Coralie to share a few thoughts on contemporary church culture. So, Coralie, I know, I see you're disguised as Brad.
Yeah,
there
I'm
on the
on here
screen.
with
There
Brad.
you are. So, if you could just take a few minutes and share your thoughts, and then Dan is going to finish us off this evening.
Gladly. Thank you, Jeffrey, for the opportunity. And the thing that really comes to my mind when I think about contemporary church culture and what I'm most concerned about, just overarchingly, is just this attitude of compromise. And it goes exactly to what Scott was just saying about a watered down version of the gospel. That, if all we're doing is focusing only on the gospel and we're trying to avoid these political issues and not talk about things that are offensive, then what kind of gospel do we really have? And it's just, to me, it's a form of compromising. And how are you going to draw people into saving faith in Jesus if you can't speak to them about how the gospel relates to these real life issues that we face every day? It almost becomes, watered down seems to be almost putting it mildly, it's not of any use if it doesn't, if it doesn't help people deal with the critical issues that they're facing today. So compromise is really what concerns me the most. And then also, with regards to what Donna was talking about and the book, Shepherds for Sale, just this infiltration of money into churches that is forcing church leadership to compromise. It's almost like the money is like a drug to them. They take a little bit of it and then they just got to keep going back for more. And they're willing to, avoid whatever topic the big donors are asking them to avoid. I know there's been a lot said about Andy Stanley and what's going on at North Point with regards to the whole LGBTQ community. And I can understand how he and his congregation want to approach that from a more compassionate point of view. But I think that all they've really accomplished is a compromising of the gospel message. It's great that parents feel like they can continue the relationship with their LGBTQ kids. And of course, I think that's important. I would never advocate for throwing out of your house anybody with any sort of problem, whether it be alcohol, drugs, whatever. I've seen it in my own family, how destructive it can be when you turn on someone who has a problem and is in need. But to just affirm them in that lifestyle is so compromising of the gospel. And it relates again back to what Scott was saying about when he was talking about how we need to know the tactics of the promoters of the ideology. And one of them is to highlight hypocrisy in your enemy and accuse them of being offensive. You know, my question back would be, take it up with God. You know, I'm not the one who's saying these things are wrong. God is the one who says that they are wrong. And we trust God, and we were trying to live the way that he tells us to live, which, by the way, is God's best life for us. So, you know, to live anything short of that, we're shortchanging ourselves. But I mean, we're not the ones being offensive. It's God's word that says that these lifestyles are an abomination to him. So just to wrap it all up, just compromise in the church is what concerns me the most, and that churches are just not being bold to talk about these issues and talk about what might be considered political issues, and how the left really has couched so many things as political issues so that the church won't talk about them. So just the spirit of compromise that's out there, I think it waters down the gospel, like Scott was saying.
Can I interject something? Our Sunday morning connect group is studying the book of Jude right now. And when she started talking, I was like, that is so, you know, verse 3 and 4, it says, I felt I had to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to the saints. For certain men whose condemnation was written about long ago have secretly slipped in among you. They are godless men who changed the grace of our God into a license for immorality and deny Jesus Christ, our only sovereign Lord. I mean, it just reminded me totally of that when just listening to what you were saying.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it seems like there are so many churches where that has slipped in and caused compromise and causes church leaders to avoid talking about certain subjects. And the Bible even warns against this and says, don't take anything away from this. But so many church leaders will no longer preach on certain aspects of the gospel so as not to be offensive.
Well, very well said, Corley. And boy, I think you just hit on, you know, one of the key problems, and that is that you know, true compassion, like true love, is not compromising with sin and evil. You know, any parent who took their responsibilities seriously, you know, we used to use this term, haven't heard it in several decades, tough love. And we need tough love. You know, I think we all could say that, you know, we benefited from it growing up, hopefully, and likewise how we tried to raise our children as well. And so, yeah, I appreciate so much your comments, your insight on that. It looks like Orrin or Brenda here have a comment, and then we'll move on to Dan's presentation.
Hi, Jeffrey, this is Orrin.
Orrin, can you speak as loudly as possible?
Yes,
yes,
I can. To continue thought that's been discussed, also in Jude, I think it's chapter 51.
Verse
51. Christ is speaking, and he says, okay, Brenda's telling me it's not in Jude. I guess I've forgotten. It says, think I've come to bring peace on earth. And he says, nay, but division. And that's part of what we're saying. And it's hard to do that at times, but that's speaking up. So anyway, that's my thought. I've got a tremendous ton of other thoughts on this, but I'm just, that's all I'm gonna say. I'll take too much time.
Well, certainly, Jesus did not hesitate to confront the religious leaders of his day, did he? And I think it's best expressed in, is it chapter 24 of Luke? I'm sorry, I don't have it right here. No, it's not. It's prior to that. But anyway, if you'll check some of the later chapters in Luke, you find Jesus very, very powerfully addressing and confronting the religious leaders of his day who were leading people astray. And so we need to do it in love, as obviously everything Jesus said and did was in love, but nonetheless very, very powerful as well. People who assume leadership in the Church of Christ have to understand that they're not they're not people whose opinions we necessarily have to take without question. In fact, they're accountable to us. And I think that that's unfortunately not very common with a lot of church leaders. Well, let's move on here. I know we're running a little bit late, but hopefully we'll have ample time here for Dan. And I know, as always, he has some great wisdom to share with us as well. So Dan Siegel, and he's going to assume my seat here.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, tonight, oops, I just bashed the computer here. Let's see, what can I do to fix that camera there? Sorry about that. There we go. Hey, everybody. Yes, Jeff and I were a little doubtful about the quality of my phone, so I thought we would come to the Areopagus Studios. And Jeff, I have to say, this is really nice. You know, I spent the evening bowling. He has a 5-lane bowling alley here. This bartender keeps refilling my drink. Jeff, you know, I think your neon sign is bigger than Joe Rogan's, but no, just kidding, folks. This is a cramped attic lined with books. It's a very tiny space here, but it's actually quite pleasant to be with you all. Donna, Scott, again, you're quite right, Millie. They did a terrific job, and I'm not worthy to be in their presence tonight, even virtually. Scott, since you had a Lord of the Rings quote, I have to have the one that I think suits our moment very well, and this is the famous exchange between Frodo and Gandalf. And y'all who are not familiar with the story, it's not, you don't have to know the story, the backstory, but bad things happen, and Frodo says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And I think that's pretty powerful and pretty important. You know, a lot of us wanted to just enjoy America, live in America, have a career, a family, a life. And it's like we're on a cruise and the ship runs aground, or the wheels come off the bus or something like that. There's a breakdown. And somehow we have to come up with some sort of solution for the bus. You know, we're supposed to be on tour. We're just looking out the windows. We don't have to fix the bus, do we? Somehow we're going to have to get out and walk. What's going on here? So anyways, and I'm grateful to Jeffrey and everyone for participation. This has been a great course, a great seminar. And we're also grateful, of course, to our authors such as Eric Metaxas. And I agree with him that this is the hour of the American church, and we do have to, you know, live up to that calling. My sense of the need is one of mobilization. So many worthy outfits need volunteers at a time when we have people here who want to make a difference. Earlier in the year, Jeffrey had me address a gathering of one class of his at Paul and Donna's, and thank you, Paul and Donna, for so graciously hosting us. And there I quoted Dennis Prager, who was a talk show thinker, author, talk show host, who as a religious Jew finds evangelicals, you know, his people. Of course, his employer is Salem Media, so he works for evangelicals. But he says evangelical Christians almost alone affirm that America has a divine mission that this country has better values than Europe, that the United Nations is a moral wasteland, that God's law is higher than international law devised in New York or The Hague, that secularism is wonderful for government but fatal for society, that Israel must be protected against those who wish to exterminate it, that the Jews have a divinely chosen role in history, and that America must remain a Judeo-Christian country. Here is one Jew who says, more power to you, keep your faith strong, and thanks. That's the question, of course, are we keeping our faith strong? Not, I mean, individually, yeah, we're only responsible ultimately for our individual faith, our individual life. But yes, collectively as a group, evangelicals and the church, we got some problems. Our fearless leader, Jeffrey here, has long lamented how many of our faith leaders are AWOL, absent without leave from the cultural battles we are engaged in, whether we want to be or not. But we have learned in considerable detail from Megan Basham in her book, Shepherds for Sale, and thank you, upside down, there we go. Shepherds for Sale, do I have that right? I do have it right. Let's hold it this way. Shepherds for Sale, thank you. And thank you, Donna, for your great presentation. We learned in considerable detail from Megan Basham in her book, Shepherds for Sale, the disturbing degree to which many faith leaders, including, yes, some in the Southern Baptist Convention, for the sake of worldly respectability or cold hard cash in the form of grant money, have caved to or even collaborated with some of the worst destroyers of Western civilization. A Christian author on Substack writes that, quote, when someone stands in an air-conditioned, gigantic, tax-exempt church building filled with comfortable seats, with freedom to worship, and often with police presence out front to protect that freedom, and tells the audience that Christians should not strive to influence society, we should not hesitate to dismiss every word of their claim. We take for granted just how much Christ's influence on the political realm has improved the lives of billions of people. And if we continue to see a backsliding, we're going to find out just how ugly the world can get without that influence. I really think Shepherds for Sale should be sold in a 2-volume set with Dr. Schaeffer's The Great Evangelical Disaster. In the last year of his life, he showed how some of the same sorts of elite evangelicals had accommodated to a disturbing degree to the sexual revolution and were promoting extremely doubtful economic solutions. And I'm grateful that Megan Basham turns out she is familiar with the Great Evangelical Disaster, and she does allude to it in her book. But anyway, this is discouraging. I mean, here many of us were already convinced that America was slowly dying from 1,000 cuts, that our numbers are shrinking, with young people leaving the faith in large numbers. And now, at this moment, our guys want, like Peter before his betrayal, to go warm themselves at the enemy's fire? Really? Now, of course, we are to love our enemies, pray for our opponents in the culture war, the one that they started. So I want to make clear that when I say enemies, that we are not out to harm anyone. But we can still clearly see that, for example, those who hold that love is love, that a man can become a woman, that the abortion clinics must remain open, that these people view some of us, thank God, as their enemies because we stand in their way between their agenda and their imagined social utopia. Whether it's a state agency demanding that we bake a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding, or Health and Human Services threatening innocent Catholic nuns with fines and jail for declining to be complicit in artificial contraception and abortion, or some new thing, we can no longer shrug off our civic responsibilities to understand what is going on and begin to push back a bit, as Scott said, and thank you, Scott. But we must be wise. Just as an example, this is something that I've learned in recent years. Just as an example, the Family Research Council, I don't know if they still do it, but for years they put on this annual thing called the Values Voters Summit, so that, in its words, quote, our nation's most fundamental values are represented as we impact public policy, influence elections, and support candidates who share our values for public office. Well, that sounds just great. There's one problem. Even if the part about our values is deleted or rewritten, our increasingly numerous ideological opponents can say, these are at most the values of one nation from some time ago. Here's the question, are the nation's most fundamental values true? That's a different claim. Nancy Pearcey, who studied under Dr. Schaeffer, she wrote in her book, I believe in Total Truth, she says, even the meaning of terms has shifted. For example, we often hear people talk about defending Christian values. Yet for secular people, the term values means literally whatever a person or group values. private tastes or preferences. Therefore, to label a position values is to discredit it. What it communicates is that I'm willing to use coercion to impose my personal preferences on other people. No wonder Christians are accused of violating the terms of democratic debate. She's not saying don't influence. She's saying don't treat it, don't buy into this framework that we're just talking about values, that we can value this or value that. There are certain real moral truths. The late Dr. Harry Jaffa spoke on this, saying, quote, this was, I think, back in the 90s or maybe early in this millennium. The Secretary of State, the President, they all talk about values. A value is a subjective desire, not an objective truth. George Washington said, the foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. If you had said, oh, Mr. Washington, you mean in our values? Washington would have replied, what are you talking about? But those of us who, we're in this battle, yes, but those of us who do somewhat grasp where the battle lines fall are few in number. So we do need to beef up our quality and quantity. I would recommend Jeffrey's works like American Crisis and his booklet on natural law and his other works, all of which you can find on Amazon under the author Jefrey Breshears. We have discussed Harry Blemeyer's little classic, The Christian Mind, with the key phrase, I believe, is in the introduction or the foreword, where he tells us what he's talking about. And he says, quote, we speak of the modern mind and of the scientific mind, using the word mind of a collectively accepted set of notions and attitudes. On the pattern of such usage, I have posited a Christian mind, chiefly for the purpose of showing that it does not exist. That is to say, in contradiction to the secular mind, no vital Christian mind plays fruitfully as a coherent and recognizable influence upon our social, political, or cultural life. Now, thankfully, he wrote this in the middle of the century. Thankfully, following the tumultuous events of the 60s and into the 70s, there was an awakening, and we now look back and call it the religious right, but there was a very broad flowering of Christian interest in politics from a number of different points of view. Earlier in the summer, I quoted from Aaron Renn, who in his book, Life in the Negative World, here's the book, he tells us this is where we are today. He contrasts three different eras in recent American history. Positive world was before 1994, in which society at large retains a mostly positive view of Christianity. Neutral world, from 1994 to 2014, society takes a neutral stance toward Christianity. Christianity no longer has privileged status, but is not disfavored. He means broadly. Negative world, 2014 to present. Society has come to have a negative view of Christianity. Being known as a Christian is a social negative, particularly in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and seen as a threat to the public good and the new public moral order. Subscribing to Christian moral views or violating the secular moral order brings negative consequences. And so it's in this more hostile environment where we have to make our case and present our argument. So we need to make good arguments. I'm with Scott on this optimism, pessimism thing. I would push back on Rod Dreher just a bit. I don't believe the culture war is completely lost. I guess I'm not optimistic. I would say hopeful. In other words, I'm not saying things will get better. I'm saying things might well get better. We serve a big God, and other civilizations have crashed and burned before. We are still here, and while our numbers are declining, we exist in numbers still too large to be exiled to some new Siberia. They cannot jail us all. So for now, we are an indigestible lump. We're this big thing in their stomach that they can't get rid of, right? And so there's just enough of us, thankfully, who oppose their agenda that we're troublesome, and thank God we're troublesome. One of my projects, and I have a lot of projects, as y'all know, but one of my projects is reviewing the successes and failures of this older religious right of the 1980s and beyond to see what can be learned. Our man Francis Schaeffer, who was condemned by more sensitive, cultured evangelicals for being too cozy with Jerry Falwell, had this to say about 1983, quote, regardless of whether we think the moral majority has always said the right things or whether we do not, or whether we think they have made some mistakes, or whether we do not. They have certainly done one thing right. They have used the freedom we still have in the political arena to stand against the other total entity, by which he meant secular humanism. They have carried the fact that law is king, law is above the lawmakers, and God is above the law into this area of life where it always should have been. And this is part of true spirituality. Schaeffer goes on, the moral majority has drawn a line between the one total view of reality and the other total view of reality, and the results this brings forth in government and law. And if you personally do not like some of the details of what they have done, do it better. But you must understand, Schaeffer says, that all Christians have got to do the same kind of thing, or you're simply not showing the lordship of Christ in the totality of life. But wait, look, we all have jobs. I drove over here across 285. We're all busy. We have to go to work every day. We have houses to clean and maintain, family to visit. So what is it that any one of us can do, or groups of us acting together? Can we really save the world as a little hobby in our spare time? Of course, we can vote, and we can financially support worthy ministries as well as ideological and political projects. A big thing for me is education. The younger generation is often just shockingly ignorant of basic facts. They can seem to lack even the most primitive understandings of little things like World War II or the Cold War. I mean, at some point, there's going to be people who are going to start falling for the old joke. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? And they're going to be like, I don't know, Lincoln. Anyway, that's about where we are in the education field, I'm afraid, today. Anyway, so I'm interested in organizations and ministries that target high school and college students. In other words, when people are forming their worldview, they're going to still have those worldviews unless we subsequently reach them or God reaches them. They may well have the same view that they're forming right now. They may still believe those things in the year 2070. So if we can reach them now, I think that's really pivotal. If we wanted to pry loose, change the direction of the society, if we wanted to stick the rudder into the wind and try to get the airplane off of this way, that's who we need to reach, is young people. Turning Point USA has some problems in my view, but they do confront students with an alternate explanation. The Center for Bioethical Reform is an outfit. They have a West Coast wing, East Coast wing, and basically, frankly, they show dead baby pictures on college campuses and then explain how the connection between dehumanizing people with slavery and Jim Crow and the Holocaust and to abortion and stuff, and they engage and they have discussions, and Georgia Right to Life does that a couple times a year as well. Students for Life, once again, they put on little conferences and have discussions, and students are confronted with ideas that they have yet to confront. And we talked about Hillsdale College. There's also organizations like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which bring the best of conservative thought to college campuses. There's a lot of worthy outfits that are begging for volunteers, people like you and me who can go right here in this town. Crisis pregnancy centers, other pro-life endeavors, homeschool networks might need us. We always have widows and orphans and the poor. I would just suggest that we might find an hour or two a week or even an hour a month that we might be able to offer to an excellent enterprise. Just as I offer this just as an example, Elizabeth, who's with us tonight, she can vouch that I have very tragically little to show for it at present. So I only offer this as a somewhat theoretical example. But anyway, on paper at least, I'm the DeKalb County chapter rep for Georgia Right to Life. If any of you live in DeKalb, contact me, please. We got to talk about that. But again, you can always write a check to organizations you favor. And of course, this is an election year. We're days away from a big international election. If you're not sure if you're registered, if you're not sure who the people that you're going to be seeing on your ballot, go to My Voter Page Georgia. Just Google the phrase My Voter Page Georgia, and you will be taken to the Georgia Secretary of State. You type in a couple of details about yourself, and you will see what your ballot, what you see, who all your reps are, your county, your district, your school board. You'll see all those numbers: District 4, District 36, et cetera, et cetera. And also, this might sound melodramatic, I know, but maybe we could rethink our lives, the lives we're living right now, in terms of personal heroism. If there's just a few of us here and there, we can try to go for maximum impact. We'll all be gone from this earth soon enough. So it's only right now, while we're here, that we can reach outside ourselves, outside our comfort zones and our first world problems. Oh, my microwave oven, it doesn't rotate anymore, whatever, that kind of thing. we can reach out ourselves to buy those diapers for a crisis pregnancy center, to deliver a hot meal, to encourage a friend, or something with a higher public profile, like a run for the school board or other elective office. I think you can get on the ballot in Georgia for less than $500, and your local county party may pay for this if you're their sort of candidate. In the face of Tucker Carlson, I will still quote from Winston Churchill very happily, and he said, and this is the spirit in which I would leave us. He said, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." Thank you, folks. Bless you. And here's Jeff.
Thanks, Dan. That was great.
Bless you all.
Yeah, he was good.
Thank you all presenters. Great job.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you very much, each of you, and Dan, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Very, very powerful, very convicting comments. You made a comment a few minutes ago that reminded me of Mark Noll's 1994, I believe it was 1994, book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. Now, his agenda and what I think most of us prioritize is not exactly the same, but nonetheless, it's making the same point, and that is that so many evangelical Christians are frankly intellectually lazy, and for them, the Christian faith is all condensed into what we would call perhaps Christian pietism. And so in that respect, I think we would share some common interests with Mark Noll. Our Areopagus update newsletter, which just went out a couple of days ago, hopefully you've seen it on our website. We have a new website, by the way. So if you haven't had a chance yet to check it out, it's same website address as the old one, www.theareopagus.org. And it's been drastically reset. Andrea Smith has done a wonderful job on that, and we're very, very appreciative. It contains so much more content than the previous website did. But in the most recent Areopagus update newsletter, the lead article that I wrote is called "The Ministry of the Watchman, a Vital Component in the Christian Response to a Changing Society and Culture." And so again, perhaps you've already seen it, but if you are not on Millie Atkinson's email contact list for her periodic Watchman updates, I would highly recommend it. It has so much valuable information in terms of upcoming events and issues. Oh,
Buy
Dan?
the Areopagus booklet, The Ministry of the Watchman.
Yes, this is on Amazon as well. But actually, that's incorporated into my book, American Crisis, as is the other booklet on natural law. Okay. Yeah, there's American Crisis. Thank you. So anyway, please do contact Millie. She puts so much time and effort into producing, again, these periodic, very quality Watchman ministry updates. And since these are matters that are rarely, if ever, even briefly alluded to in church, it's really up to each of us to take leadership in that regard and influence as many people as we know in our circle of friends and contacts. These are issues that, as I said, regrettably are not addressed in our churches. They should be, but they're not. And, we have so many wonderful pastors who truly have a pastor's heart for loving others and shepherding others. And that is so drastically important, so needed, but yet we have very few, to say the least, prophets. And I don't mean prophecy in the sense of foretelling the future, obviously. I'm talking about prophecy as forthtelling the truths of God. And too few pastors have that gift or even attempt to act in that capacity.
Paul said, I did not shrink from proclaiming to you the whole counsel of God, and so many pastors do shrink back.
Dan just mentioned that, as Paul said, I do not
Shrink back
from
the whole
presenting the whole counsel of God.
But so many pastors do shrink back.
But so many pastors do, in fact, shrink back because these are controversial issues. And again, these are oftentimes wonderful Christian people, but they're not prophets. And we desperately need prophets as well as just warm, loving, shepherding pastors as well. Well, we need to close things out. I see a couple of comments here in chat, and then if you have a closing comment. Oh dear. Okay, so Chuck is still actively involved here with his comments in the chat. And Chuck, you said that all these can be saved.
Jeffrey, one thing I want to say, you are the prophet. You are the prophet, and I thank you for it.
Well, Jay, I know you well enough to know you certainly have that spiritual gift as well. And I have so much respect for you and what all you have done in the past and attempt to continue doing there at Perimeter Church. And so, by the way, you can see behind Jay there, he is a brilliant artist. And so,
My basement. I'm in my basement. In my dungeon. Yeah, in my dungeon.
That's incredible.
Well, I've never asked you, do you have a website where you display your artwork?
I have a website, but I loaded only one picture. But
Yeah.
I'm planning to have an exhibition later this year or early next year.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So thank you.
And thank you, Jeffrey, for this class. And I'm so glad that we could all be a part of it. We appreciate you very much.
Well, I tell you, it's just the greatest joy getting to know people like you and have you all as friends. And so I feel very, very blessed. And, you know, many times over the year, you know, I left Georgia State University 24 years ago, and which seemed, well, actually, it almost was a previous century. And I'm asked from time to time, you know, well, are you considering retirement and all? And not at all. You know, I just pray that by God's grace we can continue because this really is a calling. And yeah, it can be very, very tiring at times. But the opportunity to know you all, and interact with you is such an incredible blessing. And I'm sure I'm speaking not only for myself, but Dolly as well.
Well, it's just, I think, I don't know if it was Scott or Dan who alluded to it, but you know, the Acts 17:26, that God has placed us here for this moment in history. And it's just so nice to be among like-minded friends, even on Zoom, but just to do life with. So it is easy to get discouraged, but we're here for this moment. God put us here. So may we be empowered and equipped to be his people for this time.
And I tell you, this upcoming election, as you all know, the most important election since at least 1860, when we had half the country breaking apart. And what I say is, you know, it's a complicated issue, but at least the Confederacy was not trying to destroy Western civilization. That is what we're facing today. is we have a party that is literally hell-bent on destroying anything that remains of Western civilization. That's, to use the Platonic triad, anything that's good and true and beautiful, they are hell-bent on destroying. And so this is very much of a critical election. I've heard ill-informed people talk about how Christians are overreacting, talking about how this is the most important election and so on. They don't understand what's at stake. They don't understand our history and what's at stake. Yes, we were saying that 4 years ago and 8 years ago and so on, but it's nonetheless true. This current election is the most important one, again, at least since 1860.
Yeah.
And we need to consider it to be a priority.
It does seem that people from other countries, Jay, I'm thinking about you, my friends from Iran, Araj, my hairdresser, they understand a lot more than most Americans what's at stake. And it was interesting on our Eastern European one night, one of our waiters, somehow, we try not to talk about politics too much, but somebody asked him, about the politics, and if he was born in America, but he lives now in Slovenia. He said, Trump, of course, the world was a safer place. And some of on our trip had expressed, well, they didn't really, they're Republicans, they're conservative, but they don't like Trump, so they're going to vote for Harris. So that waiter just said it all right there. And here he is, Slovenian. So we couldn't have said it better.
I want to just share one very, very encouraging news. There was a young Christian woman who lives in Swanee, and she started the young Christian conservative movement in South Korea. So she had two huge rally in Seoul last 2 years called Build America. What she is going to do is that she's going to have Build Up Atlanta rally this coming Saturday, to influence American election. So I was so encouraged that Korean community, this is the first time the Korean community is speaking up for the conservative value for this election. So if you want to know the detail, go to buildupatlanta.org. Then you can get all the detail. It's start at 9 o'clock and end at 4 this Saturday. The place is to be decided yet, but you can get all the detail. But that is the most exciting news from the Korean community. But one thing I just want to say, as you said, the whole world is watching what is going on here. That is the implication. This is not just American election. When you go to Korean website or whatever that is, half of the TV news is about American election. It is that important. Whole world is watching where this country is going to. So I think we need to continue to pray for. And I just want to share this exciting news from Korea, because I was very depressed because most Koreans are 90% Democrat without knowing what's going on, because they always just kind of Korean newspaper kind of translated the CNN and Washington Post and things like this, and there is no conservative news being sent to Korea so they can get the balanced news. But she is a courageous woman. I was so impressed by her. She was able to get Donald Trump's son Don Jr. in Build Up Korea rally this past June, and she made a big headline in Korea. So if you have time, just go to buildupatlanta.org if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Jay. And we are the only country in the world that has the power to affect world affairs
Absolutely.
in a positive sense. Now, there are several others that have the power to affect world affairs in a very negative, evil sense. So we need to take our citizenship responsibilities very, very seriously. We don't live in Bolivia or Bulgaria or Bangladesh or someplace like that. We live in the United States of America, the most influential country in the world. So let's take those responsibilities seriously.
Amen.
Well, wonderful being with you all. Really, we have so much love and respect for you. And so very much looking forward to, Dan is
Bye,
signaling
Dan.
goodbye as well. So we'll stay in touch here.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and the other speakers tonight was excellent.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank
they
you,
certainly were. So thank you,
Thank
Gail.
you.
Well, good
all.
night. Good being with you all.
Thank
And
you.
thanks to Eric Smith for hosting our session this evening as well.
Yes. All right.